When most people think about faith or faithfulness, they often think about incredible acts of courage, maybe taking a bold stand for God, maybe preaching to a large crowd, or just that faith to just kind of continue hard on while everyone's watching you going through a difficult season. And those are all examples of faith and faithfulness. But most often, faithfulness is lived out quietly in the ordinary rhythms of life. Those ordinary rhythms and faithfulness in those ordinary rhythms of life that only God sees. And in our passage here this morning, we see a spotlight that shifts. The last time we were together, we were in this Persian palace, and now the spotlight shifts from the grandeur of the Persian Empire to the humble obedience of a young Jewish woman, a woman that was taken from her home, placed in circumstances she really had no control over. In the middle of these beauty treatments, as we'll read, receiving instructions from people, waiting in obscurity, but a place where she trusted God. She listens, she obeys, she carries herself in humility, and in God's timing, we'll see her faithfulness was placed on display for an entire kingdom to see. And because she walked faithfully in the small, unforeseen moments, God will elevate her to a place in her life where she would have an incredible impact for God's kingdom. Our passage this morning is a passage that reminds us that faithfulness is never, ever wasted by God. It's never wasted by God. And as we study this passage, not only do we see the providence of God through the lens of a divine appointment, we're going to learn 3 important lessons to help us when we enter into difficult situations or seasons like Esther finds herself in. The first lesson that we learn is found in verses 8 through 11, and that lesson is, do not despise where God has placed you. Do not despise where God has placed you. Look at verse 8. It says, so it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan in the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. So it says at the end of verse 8 there, right, that Esther was taken to the king's palace. That little sentence right there, if we go too fast, we go right over it. But it's a very powerful statement, because what that sentence shows us is that this was not Esther's choice. I mentioned this the last time we were together. In the Persian Empire, when a king gave a decree, it was law, absolute law. And when that decree went out to gather the young, beautiful virgins, we saw in the first 3 verses of this chapter, the families had no choice but to comply. So this was not a beauty pageant. This is not what, it may seem that way, but it was not a beauty pageant that was taking place here. This was a forced recruitment. Daughters were taken from their homes, they were separated from their family, and they were placed in the king's harem. And in a moment, these women became property of the state. Esther might have seen this and been tempted to despise her lot in life. When you think about her life, right? She's an orphan. She's a Jewish person in exile. And now she's a young lady taken from her home and placed in the king's harem. She had every reason, by the world's standards, if you were to see the situation, to have bitterness and resentment, and to even be filled with a hopelessness. But instead of despising her circumstances, she accepted them, and she trusted God's hidden hand in this. In verses 9 through 11, we see Esther lean into her situation. That's what she does. Look at verses 9 through 11. Now, the young women pleased him And the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. And then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. And he moved her and her maidservants to the best place of the house of the women. And Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai, remember that was her uncle, had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So when we see this, as we begin to read this, I want to point out that Esther didn't sabotage her situation, right? She didn't complain against what was going on. At least we don't have that recorded for her. And the reality of it is that she probably knew it would do no good. But I believe there was something more there, and that was that trust, that faithfulness that she had. Instead, what did she do? She carried herself with grace. She carried herself with grace, she carried herself with humility and even wisdom. And she didn't despise her placement, she leaned into it with her godly character. Now, when I say she leaned into it, I recognize that that's a phrase that's often used. And I use it quite a bit. And I'm afraid that if we use it too much, and maybe my use of it too much, has diluted the meaning of it. But think about what it means. I'm using this purposefully. When we lean into something. You ever had a flat tire? And maybe you don't have AAA and you got to go to the back and get the little tire iron? There's always a couple of lug nuts that just will not budge. And so what do? You lean into it, right? You stand on it, you put all your weight. Or how about a jar? You ever have a jar where you just cannot open the jar? Man, when your wife comes and says, "Will you open this for us?" and you start struggling and you're like, "Oh, Lord, help me, please." And you lean into it, right? Have you ever leaned into something? I'm not saying this to be clever. Esther's grace was so thick, her humility was so noticeable, that when her character went before her, it moved people. That's the leaning into God's character, leaning into the situation. Her character went before her, and the weight of the grace that was upon her, the weight of the humility that she carried herself with, it moved people. And God uses the fruit in the believer's life to do that, to turn the hearts of people, and to even turn the hearts of authority towards the people. And even in the worst settings, the most worst settings, and even the most worldly settings. I was reminded of Proverbs 21:1. It says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, like the rivers of water. He turns it wherever he wishes." And he uses people like you and me, believers who are faithful to him, to do so. He doesn't need to, but he does use us. Wherever God places you, he can use you and cause his favor to rest upon you. Esther's character earned her respect, favor, and prepared her to be blessed by God in a very unwanted situation. A situation she didn't choose, but placed there by God's providence. But once she was there, we see that placement is only the beginning of what God wanted to do. That God's providence will call her not only to trust in where he's placed her, but also to be faithful in where she's placed. And we'll see that. The small, unseen acts of faithfulness, like her quiet obedience, God is actually going to use it to shape history. And so we're not to despise where God has placed us, because what may look ordinary or undesirable may actually be the very thing that God wants to use, right? And use you to display his power and unfold his plan to a watching world. God will use that. So we trust him. We trust where he's placed us. We remain faithful because his providence is always purposeful, meaning he always has a reason for what he does. He always does. And so we're not to despise despise those where he places us. I was thinking about this when I was, because I was preparing for this when I was sick. And again, I have the pity party, right? I'm like, oh man, why is this happening to me? And I'm reading this, and then God's like, Carlos, maybe I want you to go through this right now, you know? I'm thinking that, you know what I'm thinking? Oh Lord, what is it that you have for me in this? Maybe it's just to slow down for a week. Maybe it's to be more compassionate for people that fall ill. Maybe it's because he wanted to give other people an opportunity to step up and be used by God. I know that whatever he does, he has a purpose for it. And so what I do, I have to lean into it. I have to say, God, I don't understand it. To be honest, I don't really want it. But I have to trust you in it. And I have to just continue to seek to be faithful in what you've called me to do. And so we can't despise that. It's easy to despise those places that are uncomfortable. By nature, we are creatures who take the path of least resistance. But sometimes that resistance is what God wants in our lives. So we cannot despise, right? Where God has placed us, we remain faithful because his providence always has purpose. That brings us to a second lesson we learn. And that is, don't underestimate small acts of faithfulness. Do not underestimate small acts of faithfulness. Look at verse 12. He says, and each young woman's turn came to go to the king, right? To King I'm going to butcher this guy. It's actually Xerxes too, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that. That name is pronounced a couple different ways. But King Xerxes, after he completed she had completed the 12 months of preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. So the season that she's in is not a quick 1 week thing, right? She patiently endured 12 long months of preparation. 6 months of oil and myrrh, 6 months with the perfumes. And at first glance, again, it might sound luxurious, right? It might seem like a spa treatment, right? Perfumes and all that. But it was anything but glamorous for her. And day after day, Esther had to choose to submit herself to the process that she didn't want to be a part of. That was something she was forced into. Now, the text doesn't tell us that she complained, as I mentioned, or attempted to take any shortcuts. Instead, we see that she endured the routine that was placed before her with quiet faithfulness. Again, faithfulness is not always about those dramatic moments of courage. Faithfulness in the Christian life is often displayed in that patient endurance. That patient endurance. It's that person that works long hours in a job that they don't particularly like, that comes home exhausted every night, that is still faithful to be present with their spouse, that is still faithful to be present with their children, that's still faithful to pray for those that they normally pray for, even though they're bone tired. It's those people, that's that example of that faithfulness at a time when you may feel small or ordinary or even unnoticed. But to God, those small acts of faithfulness are powerful and they don't go unnoticed. It's the Christian employee that shows up on time, that works with integrity, that doesn't steal from the company. It's those small acts of faithfulness that God sees and that God uses for his kingdom. And it's in seasons when we exercise patient endurance that God is at work, refining our character, aligning our hearts with his heart. It's praying for loved ones when we don't see the results, continuing to be faithful. In verse 12, we see the patient endurance of Esther, her faithfulness where God placed her. And when you get to verses 13 and 15, we see Esther's faithfulness in trusting God's will over her own. And that's part of it. When you're bone tired, when you want to just throw in the towel, this is the moment where we have to be faithful to God and say, I'm going to trust your will in this, not my will. And that's what happens. Look at verses 13 through 15. Thus prepared each young woman went to the king and was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. So as they're bringing these women in, they're given whatever they want, right? Here's your moment to get chosen. You have all this at your disposal, right? And in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who kept the concubines. And she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by name. Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, right, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go to the king, so when it became her turn, it says she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So we see here in this passage the contrast between Esther and between the other young women. Each of the other young women, right, they saw this as an opportunity. They were given the opportunity to take whatever they desired from the harem to present themselves before the king. And they seized the moment to showcase themselves by choosing what they wanted and to implement their own strategy. They were given an opportunity to implement their own strategy to secure what they wanted to secure. But Esther, however, she didn't rely on her own strategy. She didn't. It says she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. What does that mean? It means that she said, I trust you, Lord. If he tells me to bring this, I'm just going to bring this. It shows that she wasn't dependent upon her beauty, her cleverness, her ability to manipulate circumstances. She was trusting that God, who had placed her in her position, would direct her path. In this instance, Esther's faithfulness is displayed in surrender, choosing to rely on God's wisdom and not her own wisdom. We trust God, right? We have that famous proverb, right, that's on coffee mugs, to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all our ways, we're to acknowledge him. And it says that God will direct our paths. Those are true words that she's living out. Like Esther, we're often presented with opportunities to commit those small acts of faithfulness, to say, God, I'm going to trust you in this. I trust you. I trust you. I can put my hands in it. I can try and manipulate. I can effort this. Or I can just say, Lord, I'm just going to surrender to you, and I'm going to allow you to move me where you desire to move me. And I'm going to focus on just being faithful to you and faithful in the small things. Moments where we decide not to take those matters into our own hands, when we decide not to push our own agenda forward, when we don't try to secure outcomes. In times like this, we're to be faithful like Esther. Lord, I trust you, and I trust your will over mine. I trust your plan. Sometimes we can think of faithfulness as doing more. But faithfulness is not doing more, it's trusting more. It's trusting more. True faithfulness is not about doing more. True faithfulness is about trusting more. That's what it is. I trust you in this. I trust you in this area that I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of. I trust you in an area I have no idea how the outcome's going to be, but I know that you have my best interest at heart. And I know that your words are true. And I know that you love me. And I know that you direct my steps. I have to just trust you in this, Lord, and I'm going to take each step, moment by moment, trusting you. We're never, ever to underestimate small acts of faithfulness, because with God, those unseen moments of faithfulness are never wasted. They're never wasted. At the end of verse 15, it tells us that she obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. This is what that faithfulness brings, right? And really the passage reminds us too, right, that true favor is God-given. True favor. True favor is God-given, not self-made. And God's favor always follows faithfulness. It always follows faithfulness, right? And so that's what she's doing. She's being faithful in those small things. Those small acts of faithfulness, her humility, her patience, it really positioned her for God's favor. But that favor was not the end goal, right? It was the pathway, again, to something greater. And in verses 16 through 18, Esther steps into a meeting with the king, and this situation that she did not ask for becomes a platform for an incredible kingdom opportunity. Kingdom opportunity. And that leads to our third lesson. Don't miss the kingdom opportunities in unexpected situations. I like thinking this way. Every situation that we're placed in, there's a kingdom opportunity. What is that kingdom opportunity? Sometimes it's something very small, like the encouragement of someone, but it's something that God uses. It has eternal value. And that's what I mean by a kingdom opportunity, something that has that eternal value. But we're not to miss those. We can miss kingdom opportunities in unexpected situations when we're focused inwardly and not upward, right? Look at verses 16 to 17. It says, so Esther was taken, was taken to King Xerxes into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So to those around her, right, it was just her turn. The other women were like, hey, you're up. Your turn. Yet God was at work. So when you look at this, between Vashti's removal, remember the other queen that was removed back in chapter 1, and between that time and Esther's coronation, there's a 4-year period. A 4-year period between the time that the king says, Vashti, you're no longer queen. I need to find me another queen. There's a 4-year gap. 4 years have passed, and history tells us that in that 4-year period that the king went on this military campaign. History also tells us that that campaign didn't go very well because he comes back defeated and the kingdom is actually weakened. So it ends with a humiliation and defeat for the king. So he's in a vulnerable season where he has been humbled and weakened. Do you remember how this book began with just this display of his extravagance and his power? And now we have him humbled here. He's in a vulnerable season after his worldly power and all his glory failed him. This is when Esther is brought before the king. Isn't that amazing? And again, this is the providence and the grace of God. God brought Esther into the scene, not when the king was the most arrogant, but when his heart was humbled and ready to receive what God wanted to give him. This is the hand of God. Esther did not orchestrate this timing, God did. But she was prepared for it because she trusted in God and because she was faithful in the small things. She was brought before the king at the exact moment when her presence and her humility would matter the most. And this encounter between a defeated king and Esther was a moment that became a kingdom opportunity in an unexpected way. She's placed in a position to have an impact for God's kingdom. We see these examples throughout the Bible. The one that first came to mind when I was reading this was Joseph. When you think of Joseph's life, right, it actually mirrors the life of Esther in many ways. He's thrust into a situation that he did not call for. He was just a young kid, you know what I mean, that loved God, that loved his father, had a little bit of zeal in him that got him in trouble with his brothers, right, because he was very vocal about the favor that was upon him. But they snatch him and they throw him in a well. They go to leave him for dead. Then they backtrack and they sell him into slavery, and he ends up in prison. He ends up in Potiphar's household. He goes through this entire just a season, a long season of just uncertainty, a long season of just a torture. You know what I mean? This poor kid who came from a loving home with God's hand upon him, very evident, very visible, very palpable. He could touch it. He knew God's presence was upon him, to a place where he was all alone. A place that seemed uncertain. Was he going to die? Would he ever see his father again? Has God abandoned him? But he never ever gave up hope. He trusted in God, and he was faithful in the small things. And because he was faithful and trusted God, had that faith, God moved. Pharaoh has troubling dreams. Joseph is summoned. And in a single day, Joseph goes from prisoner, right, to prime minister. From the prison to the palace. One single day. To him, what looked like an ordinary assignment, I'm just managing prisoners, because that's what his role was, right? I'm just going to interpret this dream because that's the gift that God's given me. He was faithful in those things. And it became what? A kingdom opportunity. A kingdom opportunity. Like Joseph, Esther's placement was undesirable and forced upon her. But just as God lifted Joseph from prison to the palace, he lifted Esther from an unwanted position, an unwanted place, to the throne. And Esther, her private faithfulness, we see it had a public impact. She seized that kingdom moment. And her private faithfulness had a public impact. Look at verse 18. It says, then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther. They even named it after her. For all his officials and on the servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. So it's interesting, the chapter doesn't end with just a crown for Esther. The story continues with a blessing poured out on an entire kingdom. It says the king made a great feast, right? He granted gifts. He gave relief to the provinces. And I want to notice something. I want to just highlight something. And that's Esther's faithfulness. It had a ripple effect far beyond her personal life. And this is the power of faithfulness. And this is the goodness of God, that he uses us this way. For those of you who are saved here today, that have given your life to the Lord, myself included, there was probably people we don't even know about that were praying for us. People that were faithful to think about us. Maybe great-grandparents or great-grandfather, or maybe a neighbor who saw your parents or your grandparents and prayed over them and prayed God's blessing upon them and prayed God's favor upon them. Faithful, acts of faithfulness. Sometimes they're not displayed in the moment, the favor of God, but they have that ripple effect that go beyond our lifetime. They go beyond our lifetime. So when you're pouring into a young person when you're praying for them, when you're encouraging a friend in the Lord, when you're sharing the gospel at work. That faithfulness, you may never see the effects, but you will one day when you enter into the kingdom. When someone comes up to you and says, thank you so much. And you're like, who are you? You ever had that moment when someone comes up to you? Maybe it's me. I was at the store recently and someone came up to you and says, how you doing? I was like, great. And I'm like, I don't know who you are. And then it clicked. Oh, I know you. How you doing? We're gonna encounter people, I believe, in the kingdom. When we enter heaven, faithful saints before us. Esther couldn't have imagined that her willingness to trust God in her unwanted season would one day overflow into not only a blessing for an empire, but a blessing for the future of God's people. But that's exactly what God does. And the same is true for us. The faithfulness we show in our home, in our workplace, in our classrooms, in the church. God uses this faithfulness to bring blessing to people around us, even those we may never ever meet. And so here's the challenge we leave with today, or at least what I was challenged with when I leave here today. It's the 3 points. Don't despise where God has placed you. Wherever God has us, he's placed us there for a reason and for his glory. And he can turn our present placement into those kingdom opportunities, wherever we're at. Number 2, don't underestimate the small acts of faithfulness. Remember, true faithfulness is not doing more, it's trusting more. It's trusting more. And small acts of faithfulness, working honestly, loving consistently, praying quietly, enduring patiently, right? They may feel insignificant at times, but in God's hands, they carry an eternal weight. They carry an eternal weight. So don't stop being faithful in the small things, even when they go unnoticed by others. You be faithful. Be faithful. And don't miss the kingdom opportunities in unexpected situations. What began as Esther's ordinary turn before the king became a pivotal moment in her life and a turning point in history. We're going to have seasons that are unwanted. You're going to have a season. You may be in a season that's unwanted right now. Or maybe an unwanted season or just a plain ordinary season where you're like, man, there's nothing special about my life right now. It's just so boring. Don't see it that way. God has placed you there. Be faithful. Be faithful. Because sometimes, many times, we don't see what's happening under the surface, right? We don't see what's happening under the surface. It takes time for fruit to grow. And so we just be faithful. We be faithful. And it's in seasons like this that God is preparing us for those kingdom opportunities. Our faithfulness in these seasons ripple out and bless families, communities, and even generations to come. And so this is what I want to leave us with. Be faithful. Be faithful where God has you. Now, when I read this, I think it's important to end here. That Esther's story ultimately points us forward to a greater faithfulness, a greater deliverance, and that is of Christ. One who entered our broken world at just the right time. I love it. In the fullness of time, he came into this earth. God's perfect timing. He came into this earth and he was faithful. He was faithful and obedient. He endured everything that we endured, Jesus Christ. Yet he was sinless. And he was faithful to the very end. I love when you read John chapter 13, the beginning of that, it's called the Upper Room Discourse in John chapter 13. It begins by saying that Jesus loved them to the end. Loved them to the end. And there's significant meaning to that. But it means that he's faithful to the very end, even to the death of the cross. The death on the cross. So as we get to celebrate communion, we celebrate that. We get to celebrate that. We get to remember his greatest act of faithfulness, his faithfulness. We get to partake of the bread that reminds us of his body that was broken for us. And drink the cup of juice that reminds us of his blood that was shed for us. We get to celebrate this relationship that we have because of his faithfulness, because of his goodness. What a great opportunity to, number one, thank him for his faithfulness, but also say, wow, Lord, you do this for me. I want to be so faithful to you. Thank you for all that you've done for me. Thank you for rescuing me, right? The cross was not an accident either. It was part of a plan from God before the foundation of the world, God's providence. And this is what we celebrate. So as we go through this book, the book of Esther, man, there's a lot to just really glean and learn from this, right? Next week, we're going to look at Mordecai. This week, we see the faithfulness displayed. Next week, we're going to see Mordecai, his faithfulness in the shadows. His faithfulness in the shadows. And it's going to be a blessing. Because, man, God's word is always a blessing, right? Thank you. Who said that? Thank you. God's word is always a blessing, right? One more time.